The year is late in the 4th century, and the sun has become a distant, pale memory, obscured by a shroud of slate-gray clouds that hang low and heavy over the northern reaches of Britannia. Here, along the jagged edge of the empire, the world has dissolved into a landscape of two primary elements: the biting, crystalline cold of the wind and the thick, viscous embrace of the mud. This is the frozen frontier, a place where time seems to slow to the pace of a freezing river, and where the transition of seasons is marked not by the blooming of flowers, but by the changing consistency of the earth beneath one's boots. The wind does not howl here, it sighs. It whispers through the cracks in the timber-framed barracks and whistles softly across the rounded tops of the stone watchtowers. It carries the scent of damp earth, of old pine needles, and the faint, lingering tang of woodsmoke that clings to every fiber of every garment. Inside the small, sturdy room of a frontier dwelling, the air is still. It is a stillness that feels heavy, like a thick wool blanket pressed against the skin. The walls, constructed of roughly hewn stone and plastered with a mixture of lime and straw, are cool to the touch. If you were to run your fingers across the surface, you would feel the slight grit of the plaster, the occasional protrusion of a small pebble, and the uneven ridges where the mason's trowel left its mark decades ago. Outside, the mud is a living thing. It is not merely dirt and water. It is a complex, multi-layered tapestry of brown and gray. In some places where the carts have passed, it is churned into deep, rhythmic ruts that have frozen into solid, skeletal ridges. In others, where the warmth of a nearby hearth has seeped through the floorboards, it is a soft, yielding slurry that makes a rhythmic squelch thud sound with every slow step taken. Imagine the sound of a heavy leather boot, its soles reinforced with iron hobnails, sinking slowly into that mire. First, there is the resistance, a slight tension as the mud pushes back. Then the inevitable yield, a soft, wet suction as the boot is swallowed up to the ankle. When the foot is lifted, the sound is a long, drawn-out shhh luck, a sound that echoes the patience required to live in such a place. This is the mud in which a marriage is being prepared, a union not of grand cathedrals and silken banners, but of shared warmth, of survival, and of the quiet, monotonous beauty of a life lived at the edge of the known world. There is no urgency here. The wedding will happen when the preparations are complete, and the preparations are a series of small, meditative tasks that fill the long, dim hours of the winter afternoon. Near the center of the room, a small hearth constructed of flat river stones glows with a steady, orange light. The fuel is peat, cut from the bogs during the brief, humid summer and dried until it became as light and porous as a sponge. Now as it burns, it does not crackle or pop like dry oak. Instead, it gives off a low, continuous hiss, a sound like a distant waterfall. The smoke is thick and blue, rising in a straight, unwavering line toward the small vent in the roof. It smells of ancient earth, of decomposed moss, and of a subtle, sweet musk that fills the lungs and slows the heartbeat. A man named Marcus sits on a low wooden stool beside the fire. His hands, calloused from years of handling a gladius and a spade, are currently occupied with a much more delicate task. He is cleaning a set of bronze fibulae, the brooches that will fasten his wedding cloak. He holds a small scrap of linen in his right hand and a pinch of fine wood ash in his left. The motion of his hand is rhythmic and circular. Scrape, swirl, rub. He watches as the tarnished, greenish-brown surface of the bronze slowly gives way to a dull, warm glow. He is not in a hurry. He focuses on the way the light from the peat fire reflects in the polished metal, a tiny, flickering orange spark captured in the heart of the bronze. The room is filled with the sensory details of a domesticity that has been carefully carved out of the wilderness. Hanging from the rafters are bundles of dried herbs, thyme, rosemary, and sage, their leaves shriveled and gray, but still releasing a faint, ghostly aroma when the air stirs. Beside them, a brace of dried onions hangs in a long, braided rope, their papery skins rustling like dry parchment in the slight draft. The floor is covered in a thick layer of fresh rushes, brought in from the riverbank before the first hard freeze. They are cool and slightly springy underfoot, providing a layer of insulation against the damp earth below. As Marcus moves his foot, the rushes crunch softly, a dry, brittle sound that contrasts with the wetness outside. On a heavy oak table, a ceramic bowl sits filled with grain barley, the staple of the frontier diet. The grains are small, hard, and golden brown. Earlier in the day, Marcus's betrothed, Ellen, had spent an hour slowly picking through them, removing small stones and bits of chaff. The sound of the grain sliding through her fingers was like the sound of a gentle rain falling on a wooden roof, a continuous, hypnotic patter that filled the silence of the room. Marcus reaches for a small ceramic cup filled with warm ale. The cup is unglazed, its surface slightly rough and porous. As he brings it to his lips, he feels the warmth of the liquid radiating through the clay and into his palms. The ale is thick and dark, tasting of roasted malt and a hint of wild honey. It coats the throat, providing a gentle, internal warmth that complements the external heat of the fire. He takes a very small sip, letting the liquid linger on his tongue, savoring the subtle bitterness of the herbs used to preserve it. The steam from the cup rises in soft, swirling tendrils, momentarily obscuring his vision and creating a private, humid world within the larger room. He thinks of the frontier, the miles of forest and moorland that stretch away in every direction, blanketed in a heavy, white silence. He thinks of the soldiers on the wall, their breath blooming in the cold air like small, white ghosts, their eyes fixed on the gray horizon. But here, inside the small stone house, the horizon is no further than the walls, and the only battle is the one against the encroaching chill. In the corner of the room, Ellen is working on a garment. It is a simple tunic made of heavy, undyed wool, the color of a clouded sky. The wool is thick and coarse, still retaining some of the natural oils from the sheep. As she pulls the bone needle through the fabric, the sound is a soft, rhythmic thwip-thwip. The thread is a slightly darker shade of gray, spun tight and strong. She is reinforcing the seams, making sure that no draft can find its way through. Her movements are slow and deliberate, a testament to the patience required for such work. She does not look up as she works. Her focus is entirely on the point of the needle and the weave of the cloth. The wool feels heavy in her lap, a reassuring weight that promises protection against the coming night. Occasionally, she pauses to smooth the fabric with her hand, her palm catching on the tiny, protruding fibers of the wool. The sensation is one of extreme texture, rough, yet strangely comforting. The light in the room begins to fade as the sun sinks further below the horizon. The shadows lengthen, stretching across the rush-covered floor and climbing the stone walls. The corners of the room dissolve into a soft, velvety darkness, leaving only the area around the hearth illuminated by the orange glow of the peat fire. Marcus sets down the bronze fibula and watches the flames. They are small and steady, licking at the edges of the peat blocks with a gentle intensity. The heat is constant, a dry, enveloping warmth that seems to seep into the very bones. He feels his muscles relax, the tension of the day's labor melting away in the quiet atmosphere. The sound of the wind outside has become a low, distant hum, a reminder of the vastness of the world beyond the door, but a reminder that is easily ignored within the safety of the hearth. There is a bucket of water near the door, its surface perfectly still and reflective. It mirrors the flickering light of the fire, a small, circular portal into a world of orange and gold. Occasionally, a tiny vibration, perhaps from a heavy gust of wind against the door, causes a single ripple to move across the surface, a delicate, concentric circle that expands and then vanishes, leaving the water as still as before. This stillness is the core of the experience. It is the peace of the frontier, a peace that is not found in the absence of hardship, but in the careful, deliberate management of it. To marry in the mud is to acknowledge the reality of the earth, to accept the cold and the damp, and to find beauty in the slow, monotonous rhythm of survival. Marcus stands up, his movements slow and heavy. He stretches his arms, feeling the pull of the wool tunic across his shoulders. He walks to the door and pulls back the heavy leather curtain that serves as a draft excluder. For a moment, he looks out into the twilight. The world is a study in monochrome. The sky is a deep, bruised purple, and the snow that has begun to fall is not white, but a pale, ghostly gray in the failing light. The flakes are large and wet, falling straight down in the windless air. They land on the mud with a soft, silent impact, slowly beginning to coat the ruts and ridges in a layer of pristine fluff. The air is sharp and cold, a sudden contrast to the warmth of the room. It stings the nostrils and wakes the senses, but Marcus does not stay long. He drops the curtain, sealing the room once again. The transition back to the warmth is immediate and profound. The smell of the peat, the herbs, and the wool envelops him like a physical presence. He returns to his stool, his heart beating a slow, steady rhythm, and prepares to spend the rest of the evening in the quiet company of the fire and the woman he will soon call his wife. The mud is outside, the cold is outside, but here, there is only the slow, hypnotic passage of time and the promise of a rest that is deep, dreamless, and utterly secure. As the fire burns lower, the orange glow deepens, casting a warm, protective aura over the entire room, and the silence becomes a song of comfort and peace. The night deepens over the frontier, and the silence within the small stone dwelling becomes a palpable weight, thick and comforting like the layers of heavy wool draped over the wooden benches. The fire in the hearth has settled into a steady, rhythmic pulse of heat, the peat blocks now glowing with a deep, inner crimson that seems to breathe with the draft. Marcus watches a single ember, a tiny, jagged coal of concentrated warmth, as it slowly loses its brilliance, transitioning from a bright, solar orange to a dusty, matte gray. It is a slow transformation, one that requires a patient eye to truly observe. The ash accumulates in soft, powdery drifts at the base of the fire, looking like the very snow that continues to fall silently outside the heavy leather door curtain. The air in the room has reached a state of perfect equilibrium. The chill of the stone walls is held at bay by the radiating warmth of the hearth, creating a pocket of stillness where time feels as though it has crystallized. Hélène shifts slightly on her stool, the movement causing a faint rustle of the dried rushes beneath her feet. She sets aside the gray wool tunic, her fingers lingering for a moment on the coarse texture of the fabric. The needlework is finished for the evening, but the labor of preparation continues in a different form. She reaches for a large, shallow bowl of fired clay, its surface darkened by years of proximity to the cooking fire. Beside it sits a small leather pouch containing dried legumes, broad beans, harvested in the late summer and dried until they were as hard as pebbles. She begins to pour them into the bowl one by one. The sound is a series of sharp, rhythmic clicks, tink, tap, click, as the hard beans strike the ceramic surface. It is a monotonous task, the sorting of the winter stores, but in this quiet room it becomes a meditative ritual. She examines each bean, feeling its smooth, cool skin between her thumb and forefinger, checking for any signs of blight or the tiny, circular holes left by weevils. Most are perfect, small and heavy, with the promise of a thick, nourishing pottage that will simmer on the hearth throughout the coming wedding day. The process of sorting the beans takes a long time. There is no reason to hurry. In the frozen frontier, the passage of hours is marked not by the ticking of a clock, but by the gradual completion of these small, necessary chores. Each bean that passes her inspection is dropped into a second, smaller jar, creating a new sound, a deeper, more hollow thump as the jar begins to fill. Marcus watches her hands, the way the firelight catches the fine, pale hairs on her knuckles and the way her shadows dance against the lime-washed wall behind her. The shadows are elongated and soft-edged, mimicking her movements with a slight hypnotic lag. He finds himself breathing in time with her sorting. Inhale, click, exhale, thump. It is a rhythm that speaks of a profound, uncomplicated safety. As the beans are sorted, Marcus turns his attention to the maintenance of their light. On a small, protruding ledge of stone near the hearth sits a lamp, a simple vessel of pinched clay filled with rendered tallow. The wick, a twisted cord of dried pith, is burning low, its flame a tiny, upright leaf of yellow light. He takes a small iron pick and gently adjusts the wick, drawing it up just a fraction of an inch. The flame flickers, a momentary agitation that casts a sudden, bright flare across the room before settling back into its steady, silent glow. The smell of the burning tallow is heavy and animalistic, a scent that speaks of the herds and the cycle of the seasons. It mingles with the scent of the peat and the drying herbs, creating a complex, olfactory map of their existence. He then reaches for a stack of wooden platters that sit on the edge of the heavy oak table. These are their wedding vessels, carved from the heartwood of a fallen beech tree. They are smooth and pale, the grain of the wood flowing in delicate, concentric waves that remind him of the ripples in a forest pool. He takes a small piece of beeswax, hard and fragrant, and begins to rub it into the wood. The friction creates a gentle, soothing heat, and the scent of the honeyed wax fills the immediate air around him. The sound is a soft, rhythmic hiss rub, hiss rub as the cloth moves over the grain. With every pass, the wood darkens slightly, taking on a rich, lustrous sheen that reflects the firelight. He works on one platter for nearly half an hour, his focus entirely on the circular motion of his hand and the way the wax fills the microscopic pores of the beechwood. There is a deep satisfaction in this slow preservation, in the act of preparing objects that will serve them for years to come, long after the mud of the frontier has frozen and thawed 100 times over. Outside, the wind has shifted, now blowing from the north. It brings with it a deeper cold, a frost that seeks out every hairline fracture in the stone and every slight gap in the timber. But inside, the walls hold. The thickness of the masonry, nearly 2 feet of solid stone and rubble, acts as a thermal reservoir, soaking up the heat of the fire and radiating it back into the room. Marcus can feel the warmth against his back, a steady, unyielding pressure that makes the outside world feel unimaginably distant. He thinks of the mud paths that connect their small settlement to the larger fort, the way they must be now, crusting over with a thin, brittle layer of ice that shatters like glass under the weight of a foot. He imagines the quiet of the stables, where the horses stand shoulder to shoulder, their breath rising in thick, white clouds that coat the rafters in hoarfrost. But here, the only moisture is the steam rising from the pottage pot and the slight humidity of their own breath. Hélène finishes the beans and moves to the water barrel near the door. The lid is a heavy circle of pine, and as she lifts it, the wood groans softly, a dry, protesting sound that echoes in the stillness. She dips a wooden ladle into the water, the surface breaking into 1,000 shimmering fragments of firelight. The water is cold, drawn from the deep well in the center of the village, and it carries the faint, mineral taste of the limestone through which it filters. She pours the water into the clay jar with the sorted beans, the sound a bright, splashing gurgle that slowly rises in pitch as the jar fills. This sound, the sound of pouring water, is one of the most fundamental sounds of the frontier. It signifies the preparation for the next day, the assurance of sustenance, and the simple, repetitive nature of life. She covers the jar with a clean linen cloth, tucking the edges in with a series of small, precise movements. The beans will soak through the night, softening and expanding, ready for the fire in the morning. The room is now nearly ready for sleep. The tasks of the evening are drawing to a close, and the air is heavy with the promise of rest. Marcus stands and walks to the sleeping platform, which is built into a recess in the wall to conserve heat. The platform is piled high with mattresses stuffed with dried heather and straw, providing a firm yet yielding base. Over these are spread several large sheepskins, the wool long and ivory-colored, smelling of lanolin and clean air. He smooths the skins with his hand, feeling the incredible softness of the wool. It is a texture that is almost liquid, a tactile comfort that seems to absorb the weariness of the day. He begins to arrange the heavy wool blankets, folding them back to reveal the warm, inviting space beneath. Each blanket is a masterpiece of simple weaving, thick and dense, designed to trap every calorie of body heat. As he works, he notices a small pile of stones near the foot of the bed. These are hearthstones, which have been sitting near the edge of the fire all evening. He picks one up, using a corner of his tunic to protect his fingers from the intense heat. The stone is heavy and smooth, a piece of river-worn granite that holds the heat for hours. He wraps it in a piece of old, soft leather and places it at the foot of the bed beneath the blankets. He does this with 3 more stones, creating a small, radiant heat source that will keep their feet warm throughout the long, freezing night. The sound of the stones being placed is a series of muffled thuds, a final, percussive note in the evening's symphony of domesticity. Hélène joins him, her movements slow and weary, but filled with a quiet contentment. She extinguishes the tallow lamp, pinching the wick between her fingers. The room is suddenly plunged into a deeper, more atmospheric light, illuminated only by the dying embers of the peat fire. The shadows are long and flickering, painting the walls in shades of amber and charcoal. They settle onto the sheepskins, the wool compressing beneath them with a soft, sighing sound. The blankets are pulled up, layer upon layer of heavy wool that settles over them like a protective cocoon. The weight is immense, but it is a comforting weight, a physical manifestation of the security they have built within these stone walls. In the darkness, the sounds of the house become more pronounced. The timber roof beams contract in the cold, emitting a sharp, occasional crack that sounds like a distant twig snapping in the woods. The wind brushes against the thatch, a sound like the rushing of a distant sea. And beneath it all is the steady, rhythmic sound of their own breathing, slow, deep, and synchronized. The mud of the frontier is forgotten, the ice is ignored, and the upcoming wedding remains a peaceful, low-stakes promise for the morrow. The warmth of the hearthstones begins to seep through the leather and the wool, reaching their feet and spreading a gentle, tingly heat through their limbs. The mind begins to drift, caught in the hypnotic pulse of the fire's last glow. There is nothing left to do, nothing left to worry about. The world is reduced to this small, warm space, the scent of wool and wood smoke, and the profound, monotonous peace of a winter night on the edge of the empire. As sleep finally approaches, it is not a sudden drop, but a slow, drifting descent into a sea of gray and amber, where the only reality is the softness of the furs and the steady, unhurried beating of a heart in the stillness. The frontier is silent, the frozen earth is still, and within the sanctuary of the stone and the peat, all is well. The morning of the wedding arrives not with a burst of golden sunlight or the joyous ringing of bells, but with a slow, creeping transition from the deep velvet black of night to a pale, translucent blue. This is the hour of the wolf, the time when the world feels suspended between states of being, and the silence of the frozen frontier is at its most profound. Inside the small stone house, the air is cold, a crisp, sharp cold that has managed to seep through the heavy leather door curtain and settle in the corners of the room furthest from the hearth. Marcus awakens slowly, his consciousness rising to the surface like a bubble in a thick syrup. He does not move at first. He simply lies there, encased in the immense weight of the sheepskins and the heavy wool blankets. The warmth trapped beneath the covers is a precious thing, a private atmosphere that he is loath to disturb. He listens to the sound of his own breathing, a slow, rhythmic hiss-hush, and the faint, answering rhythm of Hélène's breath beside him. The ceiling above, composed of blackened oak beams and thick layers of river-reed thatch, is barely visible in the dim light. He traces the lines of the wood with his eyes, imagining the rough texture of the bark that was stripped away decades ago. He can hear the subtle, high-pitched whistle of the wind as it catches the edge of the thatch, a sound so faint it is almost a vibration rather than a noise. It is a reminder of the vast, indifferent landscape outside, the miles of frozen mud, the skeletal trees, and the silent, watchful wall of stone that marks the edge of the empire. But here, under the blankets, there is only the soft, oily scent of the wool and the radiating heat from the hearthstones at his feet, which have now cooled to a gentle, lingering lukewarmness. With a slow, deliberate movement, Marcus reaches one arm out from beneath the covers. The transition is immediate. The cold air of the room brushes against his skin like a physical touch, a sharp contrast to the humid warmth of the bed. He feels the fine hairs on his arms stand up, a prickling sensation that travels from his wrist to his shoulder. He searches for his tunic, which he left draped over the edge of the sleeping platform. His fingers find the fabric, a heavy, coarse linen that feels stiff and chilled in the morning air. He pulls it under the blankets with him, warming the cloth against his body before he attempts to put it on. This is the ritual of the frontier morning, a series of small, calculated movements designed to preserve every scrap of heat. Once the linen is warm, he sits up, the straw and heather of the mattress sighing beneath him. The room is a study in shadow and pale light. He stands and walks toward the hearth, his bare feet pressing into the dry, brittle rushes on the floor. The sound is a rhythmic crunch-hush, a dry, percussive accompaniment to his movement. He reaches the hearth and kneels on the cold stone floor. The fire has died down to a bed of pale gray ash, but deep within the mound, a single, stubborn eye of crimson remains. This is the heart of the home, the spark that must be nurtured back to life. Marcus takes a small iron poker, its handle worn smooth and dark by the oils of his hands. He begins to gently stir the ashes. The sound is a soft, metallic scraping, scritch, as he moves the spent fuel aside. He watches as a small cloud of fine, white ash rises into the air, dancing in a stray beam of blue light before settling onto his knuckles. He uncovers the glowing ember, which pulses with a dim, internal light. He takes a small handful of dried moss and a few slivers of birch bark, placing them delicately over the coal. He leans forward, his chest close to the cold stones, and begins to blow. His breath is a steady, controlled stream of air. At first, there is nothing but the smell of scorched moss. Then a tiny thread of blue smoke curls upward, followed by a sudden, bright spark. The moss catches, a small, frantic flame that licks at the birch bark. The bark curls and blackens, releasing a sharp, sweet scent of resin that cuts through the musty air of the room. He adds small twigs of pine, then larger pieces of peat, building the fire up layer by layer. The sound of the fire growing is a series of tiny pops and hisses as the moisture in the peat is driven out by the heat. The orange light begins to spread, reclaiming the room from the blue shadows of dawn. It illuminates the water bucket by the door, and Marcus realizes that a thin, translucent pane of ice has formed over the surface during the night. He walks over to it, the cold of the floor now biting at his toes. He takes a wooden dipper and strikes the ice. The sound is a sharp, glassy tink, followed by the sound of the ice fracturing into a dozen jagged shards. He pushes the shards aside, the freezing water swirling around the wood. He fills the dipper and carries it back to the hearth, the water sloshing softly against the sides of the vessel. He splashes the water onto his face. The cold is a physical shock, a needle-sharp sensation that wakes his senses and clears the last of the sleep from his mind. The water drips from his chin, landing on his linen tunic in small, dark circles that slowly expand. He wipes his face with a scrap of rough linen, the texture of the cloth exfoliating his skin and leaving it feeling warm and tingling. The process of waking is complete. Now begins the long, slow labor of the wedding day, a day that will be spent entirely within the confines of the village, focused on the logistics of warmth and the simple, repetitive tasks of the frontier. Hélène has risen now, moving with the same quiet, efficient grace. She begins the task of preparing the morning meal. She takes a heavy stone quern, two circular slabs of gray granite, one resting atop the other. This is the sound that defines the morning, the rhythmic, grinding rotation of stone on stone. Grrr hiss, grrr hiss. She pours a handful of dried barley into the hole in the top stone and begins to turn the wooden handle. The motion is steady and hypnotic. Marcus watches the muscles in her forearm shift and flex with every rotation. The grain is crushed between the stones, reduced to a coarse, golden brown meal that spills out from the sides and onto a clean linen cloth. The smell of the freshly ground grain is earthy and sweet, a wholesome aroma that promises sustenance. Hélène works for a long time, her eyes fixed on the stones, her mind seemingly lost in the rhythm of the work. The sound of the quern is a low-pitched drone that fills the room, a sound that has remained unchanged for 1,000 years. It is the sound of survival, stripped of all artifice. Each rotation of the stone represents a few more mouthfuls of porridge, a few more calories to burn against the cold. There is no haste in her movements. The wedding ceremony will not take place until the sun is at its highest point, though in this weather, the sun will be nothing more than a slightly brighter patch of gray in the sky. Until then, there is only the grain, the stone, and the fire. Marcus begins to prepare his clothing. For a frontier wedding, there is no silk or fine embroidery. Instead, the luxury lies in the number and quality of the layers. He starts with a clean linen tunic, then adds a second tunic of fine, soft wool that has been dyed a deep, earthy madder red. The wool is thick and springy, providing a layer of trapped air that will act as insulation. Over this, he puts on his trousers, made of heavy wool twill and cross-wrapped with leather thongs from the ankle to the knee. The process of wrapping the thongs is a slow one. He starts at the ankle, making a firm knot, and then winds the leather in a precise, overlapping spiral. He feels the pressure of the leather against his calves, a supportive, firm sensation that feels like armor against the world. Each wrap must be identical in tension, a task that requires focus and patience. The leather is cool and slightly oily to the touch, smelling of the tannery and the forest. Finally, he reaches for his cloak. This is his finest possession, a massive rectangle of heavy, dark wool, woven in a dense herringbone pattern. It is so thick that it is almost waterproof, and its weight is a constant, reassuring presence on his shoulders. He drapes it over himself, the fabric falling in long, heavy folds that sweep the rushes on the floor. He takes the bronze fibulae he polished the night before and fastens the cloak at his right shoulder. The pin of the brooch slides through the thick weave with a soft snick, and the weight of the cloak is suddenly distributed across his frame. He feels solid, encased, and entirely prepared for whatever the frozen frontier might offer. The porridge is now simmering on the hearth in a soot-blackened pot. Hélène stirs it with a long wooden spoon, the sound a thick, wet glup-glup as the bubbles of steam break through the surface. She has added a handful of dried berries and a drizzle of honey, and the steam rising from the pot is sweet and fragrant. They eat slowly, sitting on the low stools by the fire, the wooden bowls warm in their hands. The porridge is hot and dense, providing a slow-release energy that they will need for the hours ahead. There is little conversation. The intimacy between them is found not in words, but in the shared silence and the synchronized movements of their mourning. Outside, the world is beginning to brighten, though it remains a landscape of muted tones. Marcus walks to the door and pulls back the curtain once more. The mud, which had been a soft slurry the day before, has frozen into a jagged, iron-hard landscape. The ruts left by the supply wagons are now solid ridges, their edges sharp and crystalline with hoarfrost. The snow that fell during the night has covered the worst of the mire, creating a thin, white blanket that softens the harsh lines of the village. The air is perfectly still, and the smoke from the other houses in the settlement rises in straight, unwavering pillars of blue and gray, like the columns of a ghostly temple. It is a morning of profound stillness, a world held in the grip of a deep, winter slumber. As he stands in the doorway, Marcus feels a single snowflake land on his cheek. It is a tiny, cold prick of moisture that vanishes almost instantly, leaving behind a faint, tingling sensation. He watches as another lands on the dark wool of his cloak, its intricate, hexagonal structure visible for a fleeting second before it melts into the fibers. The wedding will take place in the small, timber-framed chapel at the center of the fort, a walk of perhaps 10 minutes through the frozen mud. It is a short journey, but in this weather every step is a deliberate act. He turns back to the room, where Hélène is now putting on her own layers of wool and linen. The fire is burning brightly, the grain is ground, and the meal is finished. The preparations are moving forward with the slow, inevitable momentum of a glacier. There is no anxiety, only the quiet, monotonous progression of the day. They are ready to walk into the cold, secure in their layers of wool and the shared warmth of their hearth, to mark their union in the heart of the frozen frontier. The transition from the threshold of their small stone dwelling into the open air of the frontier settlement is a process of sensory calibration. As Marcus pulls back the heavy, multi-layered leather curtain for the final time this morning, the interior warmth, the scent of peat, toasted barley, and human habitation, meets the exterior cold in a silent, swirling dance of vapor. The air outside is a sharp, crystalline medium that seems to scrub the lungs clean with every slow, measured inhalation. It is not a violent cold, but a steady, pervasive one that immediately begins to search for any gap in the heavy wool of their cloaks. Marcus steps out first, his iron-studded boots meeting the surface of the frozen path with a solid, resonant clack-crunch. He waits for Hélène, his hand extended, his fingers encased in thick mittens of boiled wool. The texture of the mittens is dense and slightly fuzzy, providing a soft but secure grip as she steps over the raised wooden threshold and joins him on the frozen earth. The path through the settlement is a study in the architecture of winter. What was, just days ago, a sea of dark, clinging mire has been transformed by the deepening frost into a complex topography of iron-hard ridges and glass-like depressions. The deep ruts carved by the wheels of the heavy supply wagons are now permanent monuments to the labor of the previous week, their edges sharp and white with a delicate coating of hoarfrost. This frost, when viewed closely, is composed of millions of tiny, needle-like crystals, each one catching the flat, diffused light of the overcast sky. As they begin their walk toward the center of the fort, the sound of their progress is the primary feature of the morning. Each step produces a unique auditory signature. The sharp, brittle snap of a frozen puddle breaking beneath a boot, the hollow thud of a heel hitting a patch of solid earth, and the rhythmic scuff-scrape of the hobnails as they seek purchase on the slicker sections of the path. The pacing of their journey is intentionally slow, dictated by the treachery of the ground and the weight of their ceremonial layers. There is no reason to hurry. The concept of time in the frozen frontier is fluid, governed more by the light and the temperature than by the ticking of a mechanical device. They move with a synchronized, swaying gait, their bodies leaning slightly into the faint northerly breeze. Marcus notices the way the cold affects the world around them. The timber walls of the surrounding buildings, constructed of massive oak logs, have contracted in the frost, creating small hairline gaps through which the pale blue light of the morning filters. The wood itself seems to hum with the cold, a sound so low it is felt in the soles of the feet rather than heard in the ears. From every chimney and roof vent, a steady stream of woodsmoke rises, each one a different shade of gray or blue depending on the fuel being burned: oak, pine, or the ubiquitous earthy peat. They pass the communal well, a circular structure of gray limestone that stands like a silent sentinel in the center of a small clearing. The heavy wooden bucket is frozen to the stone coping, a thick, translucent rope of ice trailing from its rim to the dark water far below. The wind, though light, picks up a handful of fine, dry snow from the top of the well and whirls it into a miniature vortex, a snow devil that dances for a few seconds before collapsing back onto the frozen mud. Marcus watches the movement with a quiet, hypnotic fascination. The snow is not wet or heavy. It is like fine, white sand, its individual grains audible as they skitter across the ice with a soft, dry hissing sound. To their left, the long, low barracks of the garrison stretch out in a line of repetitive geometry. The shutters are closed tight against the winter, their iron hinges coated in a thick, white fur of frost. There is a profound sense of enclosure here, despite being outdoors. The high timber palisade of the fort walls creates a horizon of sharpened logs against the slate-gray sky, effectively walling off the vast, empty moorland that lies beyond. The only movement on the walls is the slow, rhythmic pacing of a lone sentry. His silhouette is bulky and indistinct, draped in a massive cloak of brown wool, his spear a thin, vertical line against the clouds. The sound of his footsteps on the wooden catwalk above is a distant, muffled thump-thump, a reminder of the constant, monotonous vigil that defines life on the edge of the empire. As they continue their walk, the details of the mud beneath their feet become more apparent. In the areas where the frost has not completely penetrated, the mud has a peculiar, leathery texture. It is firm enough to support their weight, yet it retains a certain elasticity, yielding just a fraction of an inch with a soft, squelching sigh before the cold reclaims it. In other places, the mud has frozen in a series of concentric ripples, like a pond frozen in the middle of a storm. These ripples are beautiful in their mundanity, a record of the wind's interaction with the earth before the temperature plummeted. Marcus finds himself focusing on these small details. The way a single blade of dead grass is encased in a crystal tube of ice, or how a discarded piece of leather strap has been fused to the ground, becoming a part of the landscape. The air they breathe is so cold that it creates a visible fog with every exhalation. This fog lingers for a moment in the still air, a soft, white ghost of a breath that slowly dissipates as they move through it. It settles on the edges of their hoods and the wool of their cloaks as a fine, sparkling rime. Elaine's eyelashes are tipped with tiny beads of moisture that have frozen into microscopic pearls, making her eyes seem even brighter against the pale landscape. They do not speak, for words would only break the meditative rhythm of the walk and let more of the cold into their lungs. The communication between them is through the steady pressure of their joined hands and the occasional, slow glance shared beneath the heavy folds of their hoods. They are approaching the center of the settlement now, where the path widens into a small, open square. At the far end of this square stands the chapel, a modest building that combines the local tradition of timber framing with the Roman influence of stone foundations. Its roof is thatched with thick layers of river reeds, which have turned a deep, weathered silver over the years. The eaves are decorated with long, jagged icicles that hang down like the teeth of some great, frozen beast. Each icicle is perfectly clear, holding within its core a distorted reflection of the entire village. The gray walls, the rising smoke, and the two figures moving slowly across the square. The square itself is a transition zone. Here, the mud has been packed down by the passage of many feet over many years, creating a surface that is as hard as concrete. The frost has turned this surface into a mosaic of gray and white, with thin veins of black ice filling the cracks between the stones. Marcus adjusts his grip on Elaine's hand as they navigate this slicker terrain. His boots make a different sound here, a sharper, more metallic click as the iron studs strike the embedded stones. The sound echoes softly off the surrounding walls, creating a sense of a larger, more empty space. Near the entrance to the chapel, a small brazier has been set out. It is a simple iron tripod supporting a shallow bowl of glowing charcoal. The heat it emits is minimal in the vastness of the morning, but the sight of the orange glow is psychologically warming. A thin, wavering column of heat haze rises from the coals, distorting the view of the chapel door and making it seem to shimmer in the cold air. The smell of the charcoal is distinct, a sharp, clean, carbonized scent that differs from the earthy richness of the peat fires in their homes. It is a more formal smell, a scent of ritual and preparation. They pause for a moment before the brazier, letting the warmth brush against their faces. The heat is a gentle, tingling sensation that makes the skin on their cheeks feel tight and flushed. Marcus looks down at his boots, noting the thin layer of gray dust and white frost that has accumulated on the leather. The mud of the path is already beginning to freeze into the treads, becoming a part of the boot's own structure. He takes a long, slow breath, feeling the cold air reach deep into his chest before it is warmed and expelled back into the world. The chapel door is made of heavy planks of seasoned oak, reinforced with thick bands of wrought iron. The ironwork is simple but elegant, curving in gentle arcs that mimic the flow of a river. There is no handle, only a heavy iron ring that hangs from a central boss. Marcus reaches out and grasps the ring. The metal is incredibly cold, the chill bypassing the thickness of his mitten and stinging his palm. He pulls the door open with a slow, steady pressure. The hinges, well greased with animal fat, move silently, a testament to the care taken with this building. As the door swings inward, a new set of sensory details emerges. The interior of the chapel is dim, illuminated only by a few small, high-set windows and the soft light of several large tallow candles. The air inside is stiller and warmer than the air outside, carrying the scent of old wood, beeswax, and a hint of dried lavender that has been strewn among the rushes on the floor. The transition is profound. The vast, gray world of the frontier is suddenly replaced by a small, intimate space where the boundaries are clearly defined by the heavy timber beams and the solid stone walls. They step inside, the sound of the door closing behind them a soft, final thud that seals them away from the wind and the frozen mud. The silence of the chapel is different from the silence of the outdoors. It is a sheltered, intentional silence that feels like a physical embrace. They stand in the vestibule for a moment, letting their eyes adjust to the low light. The candles flicker slightly in the draft from the closing door, their flames long and yellow, casting dancing shadows against the whitewashed walls. The floor is covered in a thick carpet of fresh rushes, even thicker than the ones in their own home, providing a soft, springy surface that muffulates the sound of their footsteps. Marcus feels the weight of his cloak settle differently in the still air. The cold that had begun to penetrate the wool is slowly being pushed back by the ambient warmth of the room. He looks at Ellen, her face now soft and clear in the candlelight. The pearls of frost on her eyelashes are beginning to melt, turning back into tiny droplets of water that shimmer like diamonds. The walk through the mud, the ice, and the cold is behind them. They have arrived at the center of their world, a place of stillness and safety where the monotonous beauty of their life is about to be formalized. The journey was short, a mere few hundred yards, but in the context of the frozen frontier, it was a significant passage from the domestic to the sacred, from the labor of survival to the ritual of union. They stand together in the soft, flickering light, the sound of their breathing the only noise in the hallowed silence, ready to begin the next slow, deliberate chapter of their story. The interior of the chapel is a sanctuary of shadow and soft, amber light, a stark contrast to the vast, monochromatic gray of the frozen world outside. Here, the air is still, but it is a living stillness, thick with the weight of history and the collective breath of those who have sought refuge within these walls. As Marcus and Ellen stand near the entrance, letting the heavy oak door settle into its frame with a final, muffled thud, the silence of the space begins to reveal its many layers. It is not a void, but a texture. There is the faint, high-pitched whistle of the wind as it brushes against the exterior thatch, a sound that is filtered through the thick layers of reed until it becomes a rhythmic sigh. There is the soft, irregular popping of the tallow candles, their wicks, twisted from the core of dried rushes, consuming the rendered fat with a low-frequency hiss. And beneath it all is the sound of the building itself, the ancient timber beams and the stone foundations settling into the frozen earth, a series of microscopic groans and clicks that underscore the passage of time. They begin to walk slowly toward the front of the chapel, where a simple stone altar stands as the focal point of the room. The floor is covered in a deep, dense layer of fresh rushes and dried herbs, primarily lavender and meadowsweet. With every step, the sound is a soft, rhythmic hush crunch, hush crunch. The scent of the herbs is released by the warmth and pressure of their boots, a ghostly perfume of summer that lingers in the cool air. It is a dry, powdery scent, one that evokes memories of sun-drenched fields and the hum of insects, providing a psychological warmth that complements the physical protection of their heavy wool cloaks. Marcus focuses on the sensation of the floor beneath his feet, the springy resilience of the rushes, the occasional hardness of a stone floor slab protruding through the straw, and the way the texture changes as they move from the center aisle toward the periphery. The lighting in the chapel is provided by several large tallow lamps, suspended from the rafters by blackened iron chains. Each lamp is a bowl of unglazed clay, filled with a thick, yellowish oil that has been rendered from the winter stores. The flames are large and soft-edged, casting long, wavering shadows that dance across the whitewashed walls. Marcus watches the way the light interacts with the architecture. The lime wash on the walls is not uniform. It is a landscape of ridges, pits, and brushstrokes, all of which are accentuated by the low-angle light of the candles. In some places, the stone beneath the plaster is visible, a dark, gray grain that speaks of the permanence of the frontier. The shadows of the rafters stretch across the ceiling like the ribs of a great, upturned ship, creating a sense of being enclosed within a protective, subterranean space. As they reach the center of the chapel, they are met by the officiant, a man whose life has been etched into his face like the rings of an ancient oak. He is dressed in robes of thick, undyed wool, the color of a winter cloud. His movements are slow and deliberate, as if every gesture is a precious resource to be used with the utmost care. He does not speak immediately. Instead, he acknowledges their presence with a slow nod, his eyes catching the light of the tallow lamps. The air between them is filled with the visible mist of their breath, 3 distinct plumes of white vapor that rise and mingle in the still air. Marcus watches the way his own breath curls and swirls, a miniature storm of moisture that dissipates against the rough texture of his cloak. It is a visual reminder of the life within the cold, a rhythmic pulse of warmth in a world of ice. The ceremony begins not with a loud declaration, but with a series of quiet, monotonous actions. The officiant reaches for a small ceramic vessel that sits on the stone altar. The vessel is cool to the touch, its surface slightly damp from the humidity of the room. He begins to pour a small amount of oil into a central lamp, the sound a thin, metallic trickling that echoes in the silence. Glug, glug, drip. The sound is hypnotic, a liquid punctuation mark in the stillness. He then takes a small iron rod and adjusts the wick, his hands moving with a precision that comes from decades of repeating this same task. The flame flares briefly, illuminating the deep creases in his palms and the silver threads of his beard, before settling back into a steady, golden glow. The words spoken are few, and they are delivered in a low, resonant drone that seems to vibrate in the very stones of the floor. The language is a mix of formal Latin and the local dialect, a linguistic tapestry that reflects the blended nature of the frontier. Marcus does not focus on the specific meaning of every word. Instead, he lets the sound of the voice wash over him like a warm tide. It is a comforting sound, a human melody that stands in opposition to the indifferent sighing of the wind. He feels the weight of his cloak on his shoulders, the pressure of the bronze fibulae against his collarbone, and the steady, reassuring warmth of Helen's hand in his. Her hand is small and firm, her skin slightly roughened by the work of the household, yet soft in the way that only life can be. He traces the lines of her knuckles with his thumb, a repetitive, circular motion that grounds him in the moment. The officiant reaches into the folds of his robe and produces a small, circular object. It is a ring, but not of gold or silver. It is made of iron, sturdy, dark, and unyielding. This is the iron of the frontier, forged in the heat of a charcoal fire and hammered into shape on a cold anvil. The ring is a symbol of endurance, of a bond that can withstand the crushing weight of the winter and the abrasive reality of the mud. He places the ring on the stone altar, the sound a sharp, clear clink that rings out in the quiet chapel. The light of the candles reflects off the dark surface of the metal, creating a tiny, distorted image of the room within its circumference. Marcus takes the ring. It is cold, a sudden shock of temperature that makes his fingers tingle. He holds it between his thumb and forefinger, feeling its weight and its texture. The iron is not perfectly smooth. It carries the marks of the hammer, a series of small, rhythmic indentations that tell the story of its creation. He slowly slides the ring onto Helen's finger. The movement is gradual, a careful negotiation of the metal against the skin. He feels the resistance of her knuckle, the slight yield of the flesh, and finally the way the ring settles at the base of her finger. The iron quickly begins to absorb the warmth of her body, losing its biting chill and becoming a part of her own temperature. It is a small, significant transition, a physical manifestation of their union. They stand in silence for several minutes, the only sound the slow, rhythmic breathing of the three people in the room. The officiant raises his hands in a gesture of blessing, his palms facing them like two weathered shields. The light of the candles catches the underside of his sleeves, revealing the intricate weave of the wool, a simple diagonal twill that is both beautiful and functional. The blessing is a long, low-pitched hum of sound, a verbal weaving of protection and peace. It feels like a physical layer being added to their clothing, an invisible cloak of stability that will accompany them back into the cold. Near the altar, a small incense burner sits, containing a few grains of dried resin gathered from the local pine forests. The officiant drops a small ember into the burner, and a thin, spiraling thread of blue smoke begins to rise. The scent is sharp and resinous, a clean, wild smell that cuts through the heaviness of the tallow and the damp wool. Marcus watches the smoke as it climbs toward the rafters, twisting and turning in the slight drafts of the room. It moves with a fluid, hypnotic grace, a visual representation of the intangible aspects of their lives. He follows the smoke with his eyes until it disappears into the darkness of the thatch, leaving only the lingering aroma of the forest. The ceremony is drawing to a close, but there is no sense of a climax or a sudden end. Instead, it fades away with the same slow deliberation with which it began. The officiant lowers his hands, his robe settling into place with a soft, woolly rustle. He offers them a small piece of bread, a dense, dark loaf made from the same barley that Alen had ground that morning. The bread is cool and firm, tasting of the earth and the fire. They share the bread, the sound of the chewing a rhythmic, domestic noise that brings the ritual back to the level of the mundane. It is a reminder that their marriage is built on the daily sharing of food, the shared labor of the hearth, and the shared endurance of the seasons. Before they leave, they pause to extinguish one of the smaller candles near the altar, a symbolic gesture of the end of this phase of the day. Marcus leans forward, his face close to the flame. He can feel the heat of the candle on his skin, a tiny, intense point of warmth. He exhales a slow, steady stream of air, and the flame flickers, dances, and then vanishes, replaced by a thin, glowing ember on the wick and a single, curling wisp of gray smoke. The room becomes slightly darker, the shadows deepening in the corners. The silence returns to its primary state, a heavy, expectant quiet that seems to absorb the last echoes of the ceremony. They turn and begin the walk back toward the door. The rushes crunch beneath their feet, the sound now familiar and comforting. The transition back to the world outside is approached with the same care. Marcus reaches for the heavy iron ring on the door, his mitten protecting him from the chill. He pulls the door open just a fraction, and a thin blade of cold, blue light cuts through the amber gloom of the chapel. A gust of wind follows, carrying the scent of snow and frozen mud. It is a sharp, invigorating scent that wakes their senses and prepares them for the walk back. They step out into the square, the door closing behind them with a soft, final thud. The world is still gray, still frozen, and still silent. The small brazier in the square is now nothing more than a pile of white ash and a few dying coals, its heat long since dissipated into the winter air. But as they begin their walk back to their small stone house, the internal warmth of the ceremony remains with them. The iron ring on Alen's finger is warm, the taste of the barley bread is still on their tongues, and the rhythm of the blessing still echoes in their minds. The mud is still there, frozen into its jagged ruts and ridges, but it no longer feels like an obstacle. It is simply the ground upon which they build their lives, a solid, unyielding foundation for a love that is as steady and monotonous as the falling snow. They move through the gray landscape with a slow, deliberate grace, two figures in heavy wool cloaks, their footsteps a rhythmic heartbeat in the vast, silent frontier. The return journey from the chapel to their small stone dwelling is a mirror image of the walk they took only an hour before, yet the world feels subtly altered. The light has shifted slightly, though the sun remains an indistinct, pale smudge behind the uniform curtain of the overcast sky. The cold has deepened, a slow, silent intensification that seems to have hardened the very air. As Marcus and Alen step away from the chapel's stone foundations, their boots meet the frozen earth with a renewed sense of purpose. though their pace remains unhurried and rhythmic. The sound of their footsteps on the iron-hard mud is a steady, percussive beat, tramp, crunch, tramp, crunch, that echoes softly against the timber walls of the surrounding buildings. The mud, which was once a treacherous, yielding mire, has now fully surrendered to the frost. It has become a landscape of petrified movement. Marcus looks down at a particularly deep rut left by a heavy ox cart. Its edges are sharp and jagged, like the crests of a frozen wave. In the hollows of these ruts, thin veneers of black ice have formed, perfectly smooth and dangerously deceptive. He navigates these with a slow, practiced caution, his eyes tracing the path a few yards ahead to ensure a stable footing for both himself and Alen. Every step requires a minute calculation of weight and balance, a meditative process that narrows his focus to the immediate few inches of ground. The sound of a hobnail catching against a sliver of ice, a high-pitched, crystalline ping, is the only disruption to the low-frequency hum of the wind. They pass a neighboring house, a structure identical to their own, where a pile of seasoned timber sits stacked against the leeward wall. The logs are silver gray, their bark peeling away in thin, papery curls that flutter in the breeze with a dry, scratching sound. A thin layer of hoarfrost has settled on the wood, making it appear as though it has been dusted with fine salt. Marcus finds himself contemplating the grain of the wood, imagining the slow growth of the tree over decades, only to end up here, providing a slow, steady heat for a family on the edge of the world. There is a profound, boring beauty in this utility. The stack of wood represents hours of labor, felling, hauling, splitting, and weeks of patient drying. It is a physical bank of warmth, a security against the encroaching winter that is as valuable as any coin of the empire. As they round the corner of the granary, a large, timber-framed building raised on stone mushrooms to keep out the damp and the rodents, the wind catches them more directly. It is a northwesterly wind, carrying with it the scent of distant snow-covered peaks and the cold, mineral tang of the sea. It brushes against their faces, the coldness so intense it feels almost like a solid object. Marcus pulls the edges of his heavy wool cloak tighter around his chest. The wool is coarse and thick, its fibers interlocking to create a barrier that the wind cannot easily penetrate. He can feel the texture of the fabric against his chin, a prickly, reassuring sensation. The wool smells of woodsmoke and the natural oils of the sheep, a scent that is synonymous with safety in this environment. They reach the threshold of their home. The leather curtain hangs heavy and motionless, its surface dark and weathered. Marcus reaches out to pull it aside, and for a moment he pauses to feel the weight of the material. It is made of several layers of thick cowhide, stitched together with sinew. The leather is cold and stiff, resisting his touch with a slow, leathery groan. As he pulls it back, the transition from the exterior world to the interior world begins. First, there is the change in the light, from the flat gray glare of the outdoors to the warm, flickering amber of the hearth. Then, the change in the air, from the sharp, thin oxygen of the frost to the heavy, humid atmosphere of the home, laden with the scent of peat, dried herbs, and the lingering aroma of the morning's barley porridge. Entering the room, they are met by the silence of an unoccupied space that has been kept warm by a well-tended fire. The hearth, which Marcus had built up before they left, has settled into a deep bed of glowing coals. The heat radiates outward in a steady, invisible wave, meeting them as they step onto the dry, rustling floor rushes. Hélène moves immediately to the hearth, her movements fluid and efficient. She takes a small wooden bellows, its leather sides soft and creased, and begins to rhythmically pump air into the base of the coals. The sound is a soft, puffing whir-hiss, whir-hiss. With every breath of air, the coals brighten, moving from a dull crimson to a brilliant solar orange. Tiny sparks, no larger than grains of sand, dance upward into the chimney, vanishing into the soot-blackened dark. Marcus begins the slow process of delayering. This is a ritual of transition, marking the return from the public space of the chapel to the private sanctuary of the home. He starts by unfastening the bronze fibulae at his shoulder. The metal is cold to his touch, but as he holds the brooches in his palm, they quickly absorb the heat of the room. He sets them down on the heavy oak table with a soft clack. Next, he removes his cloak, the weight of the wool lifting from his shoulders and leaving him feeling strangely light. He drapes the cloak over a wooden rack near the fire, ensuring it is close enough to dry any dampness from the air, but far enough to avoid scorching. The heat begins to draw out the moisture, and a faint, ghostly steam rises from the fabric, carrying with it the concentrated scent of the frontier morning. The wedding feast is not a grand banquet, but a slow, careful preparation of a more nourishing version of their daily meal. There is no urgency to the preparation. The task is the celebration. Hélène takes the clay jar of beans that have been soaking since the previous night. The beans have swelled, absorbing the well water until they are plump and heavy. She pours them into a clean cooking pot, the sound a series of soft, wet thuds. To this, she adds a piece of salted pork, its surface white with crystals of salt and pink with the cure. She handles the meat with respect, for it is a precious resource, preserved through the labor of the autumn. The salt is gritty against her fingers, a tactile reminder of the trade routes that connect this muddy outpost to the distant, sun-drenched coasts of the south. Marcus joins her by the hearth, sitting on his low wooden stool. He takes up a small whetstone, a rectangular piece of fine-grained slate, and his utility knife. The knife is a simple tool, a blade of iron set into a handle of deer antler. The handle is smooth and yellowed, polished by years of use until it fits perfectly into the palm of his hand. He begins to sharpen the blade, a task that requires no thought but total focus. The sound is a rhythmic, metallic shur-shur, shur-shur as he moves the edge of the blade across the damp stone. He watches the thin film of water on the stone turn gray with the microscopic particles of iron. The motion is hypnotic, a circular, repetitive dance that clears the mind. He is not sharpening the knife for any specific task. He is sharpening it because the maintenance of one's tools is a fundamental part of a well-ordered life. The pot of beans and pork is placed over the fire, suspended from an iron crane that swings out from the side of the hearth. The crane moves with a heavy metallic creak, a sound that has echoed in this room since the day it was built. As the water begins to heat, a new set of sounds emerges. First, the occasional lonely bubble that breaks the surface with a soft bloop. Then, as the temperature rises, a more consistent, rhythmic simmering, a low-frequency vibration that hums in the air. The steam rises in thick, white clouds, carrying the savory scent of the pork and the earthy richness of the beans. It condenses on the cold stone walls, forming tiny, shimmering droplets that catch the firelight like miniature jewels. Hélène takes a wooden bowl and a handful of dried leeks which have been hanging from the rafters. The leeks are shriveled and pale, but as she begins to chop them with a small blade, their sharp, pungent aroma is released, cutting through the heaviness of the steam. The sound of the knife on the wooden board is a rapid, percussive tap, 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 tap. She moves with a steady, unhurried pace, her eyes fixed on the task. There is a profound sense of peace in this kitchen labor. It is the work of sustaining life, performed with the same care and attention as the wedding ceremony itself. In the frozen frontier, the distinction between the sacred and the mundane is thin. Every act of survival is a form of devotion. The room is now filled with the warmth of the fire and the aroma of the cooking food. The shadows of the two figures are cast large against the walls, moving in slow, rhythmic patterns as they go about their tasks. Outside, the world has become even more silent. The wind has dropped, and a few stray flakes of snow have begun to fall, drifting down past the small, high window like the feathers of a pale bird. The snow lands silently on the frozen mud, slowly beginning to fill the ruts and soften the jagged edges of the landscape. But inside, the world is defined by the four stone walls, the heat of the peat fire, and the steady, monotonous rhythm of the boiling pot. Marcus sets down the whetstone and wipes the blade of his knife with a scrap of linen. He looks at the iron ring on Hélène's finger, which catches the orange glow of the hearth. The ring is now warm, having reached the temperature of her skin. It is a part of her, just as the mud is a part of the earth and the fire is a part of the home. They sit together in the dim light, the only sound the steady glup-glup of the simmering stew and the occasional rustle of the rushes on the floor. There is no need for conversation. The shared labor, the shared warmth, and the shared silence are enough. The wedding day is progressing exactly as it should, slowly, quietly, and with a profound sense of security. They are two souls bound together in the heart of the winter, finding beauty in the monotony and warmth in the mud. The frontier is a harsh place, but within these walls the world is small, safe, and utterly peaceful. As the stew continues to cook, Marcus reaches for a small wooden box that contains their supply of salt. He opens the lid, the wood sliding against wood with a dry, satisfying hiss. Inside, the salt is coarse and gray, glinting in the firelight. He takes a small pinch between his thumb and forefinger, feeling the sharp, crystalline edges of the grains. He sprinkles it into the pot, watching as the white crystals vanish into the dark, bubbling liquid. It is a tiny action, but it is the final touch, the element that brings the flavors together and preserves the meal. He returns the lid to the box and settles back onto his stool, his eyes closing for a moment as he lets the warmth of the room envelop him. The journey back from the chapel is complete, the meal is underway, and the long, slow evening of their first day as husband and wife is just beginning. The light of the late afternoon has begun to dissolve, the pale gray of the sky maturing into a deeper, more profound shade of slate. Inside the small stone sanctuary, the transition is marked by the deepening of the shadows in the corners and the increasing brilliance of the hearth's orange core. The stew, which has been simmering for hours on the iron crane, has reached its peak of preparation. It is no longer a collection of individual ingredients but a unified, thick pottage, a dense, aromatic decoction of the frontier's winter stores. Marcus watches as Hélène approaches the fire, her movements slow and rhythmic, her shadow stretching long and thin across the rush-covered floor until it climbs the opposite wall and disappears into the rafters. She takes a heavy iron ladle, its handle long and slightly hooked at the end, and dips it into the pot. The sound is a thick, viscous schloop-glup, a wet, heavy noise that speaks of the pottage's nourishing density. As she stirs, the steam rises in a fresh, billowing cloud, momentarily obscuring her face in a humid veil. The scent is overwhelming in its simple, honest earthiness, the salt of the pork, the starchy sweetness of the broad beans, and the sharp, lingering undertone of the dried leeks. Marcus sits on his stool, his hands resting on his knees, feeling the heat of the fire on his shins. He watches the steam as it hits the cold air of the room, swirling into intricate, ephemeral patterns before being drawn up into the chimney. There is a hypnotic quality to the movement of the vapor, a slow-motion dance that mimics the pace of their lives. He finds himself breathing in time with the rising steam, his lungs filling with the warm, savory air. Hélène begins to fill their wedding bowls. These are not the everyday ceramic vessels, but two bowls carved from the heart of an ancient olive tree, brought north by a trader from the distant, sun-drenched provinces years ago. The wood is dense, dark, and oily, with a grain that twists and turns like the path of a mountain river. As the hot stew is ladled into the bowls, the wood seems to wake up, releasing a faint, ghostly scent of the Mediterranean, a sharp, resinous aroma that mingles with the smell of the frontier peat. The sound of the stew hitting the wood is a series of soft, heavy thuds, followed by the rhythmic clack of the ladle against the rim of the pot. Each bowl is filled nearly to the brim, the surface of the pottage glistening with small droplets of rendered fat that catch and refract the firelight. They sit together at the heavy oak table, the wood cool beneath their forearms. The bowls are hot, the heat radiating through the thick olive wood and into their palms. Marcus lets his hands wrap around the curve of the bowl, savoring the warmth. It is a deep, penetrating heat that seems to reach into his very bones, a physical manifestation of the security they have built. Beside the bowls lies the bread, a dense, dark loaf of barley and rye, its crust thick and hard, its interior chewy and full of grain. Marcus takes the loaf in both hands. The texture is rough, like the bark of a tree. He breaks it in two, the sound a dry, resonant crack that echoes in the quiet room. A few crumbs fall onto the table, small, golden-brown specks that he carefully brushes into his palm and eats. There is no waste here. Every grain is a product of the earth's reluctant bounty. They eat with wooden spoons, the movement of the wood against the bowls a soft, rhythmic scrape-click, scrape-click. The sound is the only music of their wedding feast, a domestic symphony of survival. The pottage is hot and thick, coating the tongue and throat with a comforting weight. The beans have softened until they are almost creamy, their earthy flavor providing a base for the saltiness of the pork. Marcus takes a piece of the pork, the meat falling apart into tender, pink fibers. It tastes of smoke and thyme, a concentrated essence of the autumn's labor. He follows each spoonful with a piece of the heavy bread, using it to soak up the rich, dark broth. The act of eating is slow and deliberate. They do not speak, for there is nothing that needs to be said that the sharing of this meal does not already express. The silence is a shared space, a blanket of mutual understanding that is as thick as the wool of their cloaks. Outside, the first true snow of the evening has begun to fall. It is not the light, skittering dust of the morning, but a heavy, wet snow composed of large, feathery flakes. Marcus can see them through the small, high window, pale, ghostly shapes drifting down against the deepening blue of the twilight. They land on the frozen mud of the path, slowly beginning to bury the jagged ruts and ridges under a layer of pristine, silent white. The world outside is being erased, the harsh realities of the frontier softened by the encroaching winter. The wind has died down completely, leaving the air in a state of absolute stillness. The only sound from the outdoors is the occasional, soft thump as a clump of snow slides off a nearby roof and lands on the frozen ground. Inside the house, the fire has settled into a steady, pulsing glow. The peat blocks have disintegrated into a landscape of glowing red canyons and white ash plains. The heat is constant, a dry, enveloping pressure that makes the skin on Marcus's face feel tight and warm. He watches a single spark as it detaches itself from a piece of glowing peat and rises into the chimney, its light fading until it becomes a tiny black speck against the soot. He thinks about the continuity of this fire, how it is the same fire, in essence, that has burned in this hearth since he first built it, and how it will continue to burn, fueled by the same slow, monotonous labor for all the years of their marriage. As they finish their meal, the sound of the spoons against the olive wood becomes more sporadic, eventually ceasing altogether. The bowls are now empty, their dark surfaces streaked with the remains of the broth. Hélène takes a piece of the remaining bread and wipes the interior of her bowl, a final, efficient gesture of respect for the food. She then does the same for Marcus's bowl. The table is cleared with the same slow deliberation. She takes the bowls to the water barrel, where the ice has once again begun to form a thin, crystalline skin. She breaks the ice with a soft tink and rinses the bowls, the sound of the water a bright, splashing gurgle that briefly fills the room. Marcus stands and walks to the hearth. He takes a large, flat stone, the quencher, and uses it to partially cover the fire. This is the ritual of the evening, the preparation for the long, cold night. By covering the coals, he ensures that the heat will be released slowly throughout the night, and that a core of glowing embers will remain to start the fire the following morning. The sound of the stone sliding over the hearth is a heavy, grinding hush, a finality that marks the end of the day's active labor. The room grows slightly darker as the direct light of the flames is obscured, leaving only the soft, ambient glow of the embers and the flickering light of a single tallow lamp. He then turns his attention to the windows. Although they are small, they are a source of heat loss. He takes 2 thick pads of felted wool and wedges them into the window recesses. The wool is dense and heavy, smelling of lanolin. As he presses the felt into place, the last of the exterior world is shut out. The room is now a sealed vessel, a pocket of warmth and light in a landscape of ice and shadow. The silence becomes even more profound, a deep, heavy quiet that seems to vibrate in the ears. It is a silence that is not empty but full full of the scent of the peat, the warmth of the wool, and the steady, rhythmic presence of two lives intertwined. Hélène is preparing the sleeping platform. She has brought in fresh hearth stones, which have been heating near the fire all through the meal. She wraps them in layers of old, soft linen and places them beneath the sheepskins. Marcus watches her hands as she smooths the furs, the firelight catching the iron ring on her finger. The ring is now a part of her, a dark, unyielding circle that reflects the constancy of their world. She moves with a grace that is born of routine, a slow, hypnotic rhythm that makes the act of making a bed seem like a sacred ritual. The sheepskins are thick and ivory-colored, their wool long and soft. As she presses them down, they release a faint, clean scent that mingles with the warmth of the room. The atmosphere in the house has reached a state of perfect stillness. The air is heavy and warm, the light is soft and golden, and the sounds are reduced to the absolute minimum. The slow, rhythmic ticking of the cooling hearth stones, the faint rustle of the rushes, and the steady, synchronized breathing of the two people within. This is the goal of the wedding day, not a celebration of excitement or change, but a celebration of this very stillness, this very security. To be married in the mud is to find a center that does not move, even as the world around it freezes and thaws. Marcus sits on the edge of the sleeping platform, removing his heavy leather boots. The sound of the laces being undone is a soft, rhythmic zip-pull, zip-pull. He feels the relief as the pressure of the leather is removed, his feet meeting the soft, springy warmth of the sheepskins. He lines the boots up neatly near the hearth, the iron hobnails catching the last of the light. They are caked with the mud and snow of the day's journey, a record of where they have been, but for now they are no longer needed. He lies back onto the furs, the wool compressing beneath his weight with a soft, sighing sound. The blankets are pulled up, layer after layer of heavy, woven wool that settles over him like a protective cocoon. The weight of the blankets is immense, a physical pressure that encourages the muscles to relax and the mind to drift. Beneath his feet, he can feel the radiating warmth of the hearth stones, a gentle, tingly heat that spreads upward through his limbs. The world outside the house, the frozen frontier, the miles of silent moorland, the dark, jagged wall of stone, feels unimaginably distant. It is a world of gray and white, of wind and ice, but it has no power here. Inside the stone walls, under the heavy thatch, there is only the warmth, the light, and the slow, monotonous passage of time. Hélène joins him, her presence a familiar, comforting warmth beside him. They do not speak. The language of the evening is the language of the hearth and the wool. They lie in the darkness, watching the patterns of the dying embers as they play across the ceiling. The shadows are long and soft, moving with a slow, hypnotic lag. The sound of the wind has returned, but it is now a distant, harmless whisper, a reminder of the safety they have achieved. Marcus feels his eyelids growing heavy, the rhythmic pulse of his own heart slowing to match the pulse of the cooling fire. The day is done, the marriage is sealed, and the long, dreamless sleep of the winter night is finally approaching. In the heart of the frozen frontier, all is quiet. All is warm and all is well. The mud is forgotten, the cold is held at bay, and the only reality is the softness of the furs and the steady, unhurried beating of a heart in the stillness of the home. The middle of the night on the frozen frontier is a time of absolute crystalline stillness, a period where the world seems to have forgotten the very concept of motion. Inside the stone walls of the small dwelling, the air has reached a state of heavy, cool equilibrium. The fire, tucked away beneath the heavy quencher stone, is no longer a source of light, but a silent, radiating heart of heat that pulses with a dim, subterranean energy. Marcus lies in the deep, velvety darkness, his consciousness suspended in that thin, peaceful layer between sleep and wakefulness. He is aware of the weight of the world above him, the thick oak rafters, the heavy layers of reed thatch, and the accumulation of fresh, wet snow that now blankets the roof. This weight is not oppressive. It is a profound source of security, a physical confirmation that the structure is holding firm against the immense, silent pressure of the winter night. The sensation of the bedding is the primary reality of the hour. Beneath him, the mattress of dried heather and straw has compressed into a firm, supportive cradle that has absorbed the warmth of his body over the many hours of rest. The sheepskins are a sea of soft, oily texture, their long wool fibers interlocking to create a microscopic forest of trapped air. Marcus feels the way the wool yields to the slightest movement of his shoulder, a soft, muffled rustle that is more a vibration than a sound. Over him, the blankets are a landscape of density. Each one is a product of months of spinning and weaving, the wool thick and slightly coarse, yet possessing an incredible capacity for insulation. He can feel the physical pressure of the blankets on his chest, a steady, rhythmic weight that rises and falls with his breathing. It is a comforting pressure, like the hand of a giant, ensuring that no scrap of warmth can escape into the cooling room. In the absolute silence, the sounds of the night become magnified and distinct. There is the occasional, sharp crack of the timber beams, a sound like a distant mallet hitting a wooden peg, as the frost causes the oak to contract and settle. There is the faint, high-pitched whistle of the wind as it finds a microscopic fissure in the masonry, a sound that quickly fades back into the general sigh of the moorland. But the most prominent sound is the internal rhythm of the house, the slow, deep, synchronized breathing of Marcus and Ellen. Their breaths are long and even, a pair of rhythmic waves that overlap and diverge in a hypnotic pattern. Marcus finds himself focusing on the slight pause at the end of each exhalation, a moment of perfect stillness before the next breath begins. It is a cycle that has no beginning and no end, a monotonous song of survival that has played out in this room for generations. Beside him, Ellen shifts slightly in her sleep, the motion causing the heavy wool to slide over the sheepskins with a low-frequency hush-shhh. Marcus feels the movement of her arm, and for a moment, his hand brushes against hers. Her skin is warm, a sharp contrast to the cool air that touches his nose and forehead. He feels the iron ring on her finger, a small, hard, circular presence that has now fully adopted the temperature of her body. It is no longer a foreign object. It is a part of her, a symbol of their union that is as enduring and unyielding as the stone walls themselves. He lets his fingers rest near the ring, the texture of the hammered metal, a subtle, tactile detail in the darkness. Outside, the snow continues its silent descent. Marcus imagines the scene beyond the leather curtain, the frozen mud of the square now entirely hidden beneath a thick, undulating blanket of white. The jagged ruts, The sharp-edged ridges and the glass-like puddles have all been smoothed over, replaced by a soft, uniform landscape that reflects the faint, ambient light of the stars above the cloud layer. The village is a cluster of white mounds, each one topped by a thin, ghostly plume of blue smoke that rises from a well-tended hearth. The silence out there is even more profound than the silence inside, a heavy, muffling quiet that absorbs the sound of the wind and the distant cry of a winter bird. The world has been simplified into two states: the cold, white vastness of the exterior and the warm, dark intimacy of the interior. As the hours crawl toward the pre-dawn, the cold begins to mount its most persistent challenge. The temperature in the room drops by a few more degrees, and Marcus can feel the shift on the tip of his ears and the bridge of his nose. He pulls the blankets higher, tucking the edges beneath his chin, until only a small opening remains for his breath. The air he inhales is now sharply cold, a crisp, clean sensation that wakes the senses without disturbing the deep relaxation of his body. He watches the faint, white mist of his breath as it rises from the covers, a pale, translucent ghost that lingers for a second before vanishing into the dark. It is a visual record of his life, a rhythmic pulse of heat in a world that is slowly freezing solid. He thinks about the water barrel by the door. By now, the ice on its surface will have thickened, turning from a thin pane into a solid plate of translucent white. The moisture in the air will have crystallized on the interior of the stone walls, creating a delicate, sparkling rime of frost that traces the outlines of every stone and every layer of plaster. If he were to reach out and touch the wall, his fingers would find a texture like fine sand, a cold, gritty sensation that would immediately numbing the skin. But here, in the heart of the bedding, the frost has no power. The hearthstones at his feet are still holding a trace of warmth, a gentle, lingering glow that keeps the chill from reaching his toes. It is a masterpiece of thermal management, a slow, calculated defense against the environmental reality of the frontier. The transition from the deep night to the first hint of morning is a process that takes an eternity. There is no sudden alarm, no shift in the light that signals the change. Instead, it is a gradual thinning of the darkness, a slow progression from the velvet black of midnight to a deep, bruised purple. Marcus watches the rafters above him as they slowly begin to emerge from the shadows. At first, they are merely darker lines against a dark ceiling, but as the minutes pass, their textures and shapes become visible. The rough grain of the oak, the dark stains of the soot, and the intricate weave of the thatch above. The light is not coming from the sun, but from the snow outside, which has begun to catch the first, indirect rays of the approaching dawn and reflect them through the small, high windows and the gaps in the leather curtain. The sound of the morning begins with a single, lonely note, the rhythmic crunch-crunch of a sentry's boots on the fresh snow outside. The sound is muffled and distant, but in the absolute quiet of the room, it is as clear as a bell. Marcus follows the sound as it moves along the perimeter of the house, imagining the man in his heavy wool cloak, his spear held tight against his side, his breath blooming in the frozen air. It is a reminder that the world is beginning to wake, that the monotonous cycle of the frontier is about to begin anew. But for now, there is no need to move. The fire is still safe beneath the stone, the water is still frozen in the barrel, and the warmth of the bed is still the most important thing in existence. He turns his head slightly, watching Hélène as she sleeps. Her face is soft and peaceful in the dim, purple light, her eyelashes casting long, delicate shadows against her cheeks. He feels a profound sense of gratitude for this stillness, for the slow, predictable nature of their lives. To live in the mud of the frontier is to accept a life of repetitive labor and constant vigilance, but it is also to experience a depth of peace that is unknown in more frantic places. Their marriage is not a story of grand gestures or dramatic changes. It is a story of shared breaths in the dark, of the weight of wool blankets, and of the steady, unhurried passage of a winter night. The blue hour arrives, the time when the world is washed in a pale, ethereal light that makes everything seem surreal and weightless. Marcus decides it is time to begin the slow process of relighting the home. He moves with extreme deliberation, careful not to disturb the pocket of warmth he has inhabited for the last 8 hours. He slides his legs out from under the blankets, the cold air hitting his skin with a sharp, invigorating sting. He finds his heavy wool socks which have been sitting near the hearth and pulls them on. The wool is thick and slightly scratchy, but as soon as they are on his feet, he feels a surge of warmth. He stands up, the rushes on the floor crunching softly beneath his feet, a dry, brittle sound that seems loud in the quiet room. He walks to the hearth and kneels on the cold stone floor. He reaches for the quencher stone, his fingers finding the cool, smooth surface of the granite. With a slow, steady pull, he slides the stone aside. The sound is a heavy, grinding hiss that echoes in the stillness. Beneath the stone, the embers are waiting, a bed of deep, pulsing crimson that glows with a fierce, internal light. He takes a small handful of dried birch bark and a few slivers of pine, placing them delicately over the coals. He leans forward, his chest close to the stones, and begins to blow. His breath is a steady, controlled stream, a rhythmic pulse of air that coaxes the fire back to life. The birch bark curls and blackens, releasing a sharp, sweet scent of resin that fills the immediate air. Then, a tiny blue flame appears, dancing over the surface of the bark before growing into a steady, orange flicker. Marcus adds more fuel, larger pieces of peat, and a few chunks of seasoned oak. The sound of the fire growing is a series of tiny pops and hisses, a domestic symphony that marks the official start of the day. The orange light begins to spread, chasing the blue shadows from the corners of the room and reflecting in the ice-coated water barrel. He stands and watches the flames for a moment, feeling the heat begin to radiate outward, reclaiming the room from the night's chill. The first task of the new day is complete, and the long, slow, boring beauty of their life on the frontier continues its inevitable, peaceful progression. The fire is now a confident, living entity, its orange tendrils wrapping around the dark blocks of peat with a slow, consuming grace. The room, which only an hour ago was a cavern of blue-tinted shadows, is now bathed in a rich, honeyed glow that reaches into the deepest recesses of the stone walls. Marcus stands by the hearth, the heat pressing against the front of his wool leggings, a steady and unyielding force that contrasts sharply with the lingering chill at his back. He watches the way the smoke is drawn upward into the flue, a continuous, fluid ribbon of gray that seems to vibrate slightly in the upward draft. The sound is a low-pitched hum, a domestic white noise that provides a foundational layer to the morning's silence. With the fire established, Marcus turns his attention to the water barrel, a stout vessel of oak bound with rusted iron hoops. During the night, the frost has worked its silent magic, and the surface is now covered by a plate of ice nearly 2 fingers thick. He reaches for a heavy wooden mallet, its handle worn to a silky smoothness by years of contact with his palm. The act of breaking the ice is a ritual of precision. He strikes the center of the barrel with a measured blow. The sound is a dull, resonant thud, followed immediately by the sharp, musical crack of the ice fracturing. He strikes again, and the plate shatters into a dozen jagged, translucent shards that bob and swirl in the dark water below. He uses a copper ladle to scoop out the larger pieces of ice, the metal clinking rhythmically against the oak staves. Tink, slosh, tink. He drops the ice onto the floor rushes, where it glints like fallen diamonds in the firelight, before beginning its slow, inevitable transition back to liquid. He fills a large ceramic pitcher with the freezing water, the weight of the vessel increasing as the liquid pours in with a bright, splashing gurgle. The water is so cold it makes the clay surface of the pitcher break out in a fine mist of condensation. He carries the pitcher back to the hearth, placing it on a flat stone near the embers to take the edge off the chill. He then takes a small handful of dried mint and rose hips from a bundle hanging above the fire. The herbs are brittle and gray, but as he crushes them between his fingers, they release a sudden, vibrant burst of summer, a scent that is both sharp and sweet, cutting through the heavy, earthy aroma of the peat smoke. He drops the herbs into the water, watching as they swirl and dance in the heat-agitated liquid, slowly turning the water a pale, amber hue. Hélène is now fully awake, moving with the slow, rhythmic grace that defines her existence in the frontier. She has shed the heavy top blankets but remains wrapped in a large shawl of undyed wool, the fringe trailing across the sheepskins as she sits up. She watches Marcus work, her eyes reflecting the orange pulse of the fire. The room is quiet, save for the soft sounds of the house waking up, the expansion of the roof timbers, the bubbling of the water, and the rhythmic shuff-shuff of the rushes as Marcus moves about. There is no urgency to the morning. On the frontier, the first few hours of the day are dedicated entirely to the maintenance of the environment. She joins him by the fire, her bare feet finding the warm spots on the floor stones near the hearth. She takes up the task of preparing the morning grain. Today, it is oats, heavy golden kernels that have been toasted over the fire in a flat pan until they smell of roasted nuts and sun-baked earth. She uses a small hand mill, a portable version of the larger quern, to crack the oats. The sound is a consistent, low-frequency grinding, crush-whir, as the stones move against one another. The vibration travels through the floor, a subtle hum that Marcus can feel in the soles of his feet. He finds himself swaying slightly in time with the motion, a hypnotic, physical response to the monotony of the task. Once the oats are cracked, they are added to the simmering water. The sound of the morning meal changes then, transitioning from the dry rasp of the mill to the wet, rhythmic bubbling of the pottage. Hélène stirs the mixture with a long spoon made of apple wood, the wood having taken on a dark, polished patina from years of immersion in boiling grains. She moves the spoon in slow, concentric circles, ensuring that the oats do not stick to the bottom of the pot. As the starch is released, the liquid thickens, and the bubbles become larger and more infrequent, breaking the surface with a heavy, satisfying plop. The steam rising from the pot is thick and white, carrying the wholesome, uncomplicated scent of the grain. Marcus walks to the door to perform the morning's first inspection of the world outside. He pulls back the leather curtain, and for a moment, the sheer brilliance of the scene takes his breath away. The snow has stopped falling, and the sky has cleared to a pale, translucent blue that seems to stretch into infinity. The world is transformed. The mud, the ruts, and the jagged ridges of the path are gone, buried under a pristine, undulating blanket of white that is nearly a foot deep. The light is blinding, reflected off a billion tiny ice crystals that have formed on the surface of the snow. It is a world of absolute purity and absolute silence. He steps out onto the threshold, his boots sinking into the fresh powder with a soft, compressed crunch. The air is incredibly thin and cold, a sharp, bracing medium that stings the nostrils and wakes the senses with a jolt of clarity. He looks toward the fort's walls, seeing the line of the palisade traced in white. The sentries are still there, their cloaks now frosted with snow, looking like statues of ice against the blue sky. He looks down at the ground near the door. A small bird, perhaps a robin or a sparrow, has left a delicate trail of footprints across the drift, tiny, three-pointed stars that march in a straight line before disappearing into the shadow of a woodpile. The silence of the snowy morning is different from the silence of the night. It is an active silence, a muffling of the world that makes every small sound, the snap of a frozen twig, the distant lowing of a cow in the stables, seem intimate and significant. Marcus breathes deeply, feeling the cold air fill his lungs like a draft of mountain water. He exhales, a long, thick plume of white vapor that hangs in the still air for several seconds before slowly drifting upward. He stays there for a few minutes, simply existing in the vast, white landscape, letting the cold ground him in the reality of the season. Returning inside, the warmth of the house hits him like a physical embrace. The contrast is profound, from the crystalline, blue-white world of the exterior to the warm, amber-hued sanctuary of the interior. He drops the leather curtain, sealing the room once more. The smell of the oats is now dominant, a rich, nutty aroma that signals the meal is ready. They eat as they did the day before, sitting on the low stools by the fire, the wooden bowls warm in their hands. They add a small spoonful of honey to the oats, the thick, golden liquid spiraling into the gray pottage and melting into a sweet, fragrant pool. The honey tastes of the heather that grows on the moors, a concentrated essence of the summer that they carry with them through the dark months. The rest of the morning is spent in a state of quiet, productive monotony. Marcus takes up a piece of leather that he is fashioning into a new set of harness straps for their small cart. The leather is thick and stubborn, having been tanned with oak bark until it is as tough as the wood itself. He uses a bone awl to punch holes in the material, the sound a rhythmic thump pop as the tool pierces the hide. He then uses a thick needle and waxed linen thread to stitch the layers together. The thread is coated in beeswax, which makes a soft, scratching sound as it is pulled through the leather. Scritch, pull, snap. He works with a slow, deliberate pace, his focus entirely on the spacing of the stitches and the tension of the thread. Hélène, meanwhile, has taken up her spindle. She is spinning wool that was shorn from their own sheep in the spring, wool that has been washed, carded, and dyed a deep, earthy green with the lichen gathered from the forest stones. The spindle is a simple tool, a wooden shaft with a clay whorl at the bottom to provide momentum. She sets the spindle spinning with a deft flick of her wrist, the wood humming as it rotates. She draws out the wool fibers from a bundle tucked under her arm, her fingers moving with a hypnotic, practiced rhythm as she twists the wool into thread. The spindle dances near the floor, a blur of green and brown before she catches it, winds the new thread onto the shaft and begins again. Flick, hum, draw, wind. Flick, hum, draw, wind. The sounds of the room, the scratching of the thread, the humming of the spindle, the bubbling of the water, and the steady pulse of the fire, blend into a single, seamless tapestry of domesticity. This is the heart of the boring history of the frontier. It is not a history of battles or kings, but a history of these small, repetitive actions that sustain life in the face of the cold. The hours pass without notice, the light shifting slowly across the rush-covered floor as the sun makes its low arc across the southern sky. The shadows of the rafters lengthen and shorten, marking the passage of time with a silent, geometric precision. Occasionally, Marcus pauses in his work to add a fresh block of peat to the fire. He handles the fuel with a certain reverence, knowing that each block represents a day of labor in the summer bogs. He places the peat carefully, ensuring that there is enough space for the air to circulate. He watches as the edges of the block begin to glow, the dark, fibrous material transforming into a radiant, orange coal. The heat remains constant, a dry, enveloping presence that makes the vastness of the snowy world outside feel like a distant dream. As the mid-morning lull settles over the house, they both find themselves drifting into a state of meditative calm. The labor is not difficult, but it requires a constant, quiet attention that precludes any sense of hurry or stress. They are perfectly synchronized with the rhythm of the season, a season that demands patience, endurance, and a focus on the immediate, the tangible, and the warm. The marriage, only a day old, has already found its pace within this larger rhythm. They are two parts of a single, slow-moving machine, designed to navigate the frozen frontier with a steady, unhurried grace. The room is filled with a sense of profound security. The walls are thick, the fire is bright, and the stores are full. The mud is buried, the ice is managed, and the future is a long, peaceful stretch of similar mornings. Marcus looks at the iron ring on Hélène's finger, seeing it flash in the firelight as she moves her hand to adjust the wool. It is a small, dark circle of constancy in a world of shifting snow and fading light. He returns to his leather work, the sound of the awl and the thread a comforting accompaniment to the silence of the winter. They are safe, they are warm, and they are together, lost in the beautiful, monotonous peace of their first morning on the frozen frontier. The sun begins its early, slow-motion descent toward the western horizon, a journey that is marked more by the deepening of the shadows than by any change in the color of the sky. The pale blue of the afternoon matures into a dense, translucent violet, a shade that seems to hold the very essence of the cold. Inside the stone house, The transition is gradual and profound. The orange light of the hearth, once a secondary presence to the daylight, now reclaims its dominance, casting long, wavering fingers of warmth across the timber rafters and the rush-strewn floor. Marcus puts aside his leatherwork, the bone awl and the waxed thread making a soft, final clack hiss as they are settled into their wooden chest. His hands feel heavy and warm, the muscles in his fingers pulsing with a dull, satisfied ache from the day's repetitive labor. He watches a single, dust-mote-filled beam of light as it retreats across the table, noticing how the grain of the oak seems to absorb the light rather than reflect it, like a sponge soaking up the last of the day's energy. This is the hour of the final accounting. Marcus reaches for a small, thin ledger made of smoothed vellum, its edges yellowed and slightly curled by the humidity of the room. Beside it sits a small ceramic inkwell, the ink inside made of crushed oak galls and iron salts, a dark, pungent liquid that smells of the forest and the forge. He takes up a sharpened goose quill, its white feather catching the firelight. The act of recording the winter stores is the height of frontier monotony, a task performed with a meditative slowness. He dips the quill into the ink, the sound a tiny, liquid plink. He pauses, letting the excess ink drip back into the well before bringing the nib to the vellum. The sound of the writing is a rhythmic, scratching scritch that fills the quiet room. He records the number of grain sacks remaining, the barrels of salted pork, the jars of dried beans, and the remaining bundles of peat. Each entry is a small victory against the winter, a numerical confirmation of their survival. The texture of the vellum is slightly oily under his hand, an organic surface that feels alive compared to the cold stone of the walls. Hélène, meanwhile, is engaged in the final domestic ritual of the day, the cleaning of the wooden vessels. She takes a large basin of warm water, drawn from the pot that has sat near the fire all afternoon. The steam rises in a gentle, lazy spiral, carrying the faint, clean scent of the boiled water. She takes a small brush made of stiff heather twigs and begins to scrub the olive wood bowls from their meal. The sound is a rhythmic, abrasive scrush-hush as the twigs move against the grain of the wood. She is thorough and slow, ensuring that every trace of the pottage is removed. The water in the basin gradually turns cloudy, the surface covered in a thin, shimmering film of oil from the pottage. She rinses each bowl with fresh water, the sound a bright, splashing gurgle that punctuates the low-frequency hum of the room. Once cleaned, she wipes them dry with a piece of coarse linen, the fabric making a soft, squeaking sound as it moves over the polished wood. She stacks the bowls neatly on the shelf, the wood meeting wood with a muffled, satisfying thud. As the last of the light vanishes from the sky, the world outside is plunged into a deep, crystalline darkness. The moon, a thin sliver of silver, rises over the white-capped moorland, its light reflecting off the snow to create a ghostly, silver glow that filters through the small window. The wind remains absent, leaving the frontier in a state of absolute, breathless silence. Inside, Marcus completes his ledger and closes the vellum book with a soft, final flump. He cleans the nib of his quill with a scrap of wool, the fibers catching on the slit of the feather with a tiny, high-pitched snag. He then reaches for the final luxury of the evening, a small pouch of dried meadowsweet and hawthorn berries. He drops them into a ceramic pot of hot water, the berries bobbing on the surface like tiny, red buoys. The scent that arises is delicate and sweet, a floral memory of the spring that provides a sensory bridge to the coming year. They drink the herbal tea slowly, sitting on the edge of the sleeping platform. The ceramic cups are warm in their hands, the heat seeping through the clay and into their palms, radiating upward through their arms. The tea is hot and slightly tart, coating the tongue and throat with a gentle, soothing warmth. Marcus watches the way the steam from his cup swirls in the air, a miniature weather system that is governed by the soft currents of the room. He feels the weight of the day's labor melting away, replaced by a deep, heavy tranquility. The iron ring on Elend's finger is a dark, steady presence in the firelight, a symbol of the bond that is now as much a part of the house as the hearth itself. They do not speak. The silence is a physical thing, a thick, protective layer that seals them away from the vastness of the empire and the indifference of the frost. Now comes the time for the banking of the fire, the most critical task of the winter night. Marcus kneels before the hearth, the heat of the glowing coals pressing against his face. He takes the heavy iron shovel and begins to move the outer layer of white ash over the core of glowing crimson peat. This is the sleep of the fire, a process of insulation that ensures the embers will survive until the morning. The sound is a soft, powdery shush-shush as the ash is distributed. He works with extreme care, leaving just enough of a vent for a tiny amount of air to reach the coals. He then places the large quencher stone over the center, the granite meeting the hearthstones with a heavy, grinding thud. The room immediately grows darker, the flickering orange flames replaced by a deep, ambient crimson that pulses like a slow heartbeat. The shadows in the corners expand, turning the room into a soft-edged sanctuary of velvet black and amber. They move to the bed, the rushes on the floor making a final, brittle crunch beneath their feet. Marcus removes his outer tunic, the wool rustling softly as it is draped over the wooden chest. He feels the cool air of the room on his skin for a fleeting second before he slides beneath the heavy wool blankets and onto the soft, dense sheepskins. The bedding is a landscape of texture. The springy heather mattress, the liquid softness of the ivory wool, and the immense, reassuring weight of the blankets. He pulls the covers up to his chin, the wool smelling of clean air and the faint, sweet scent of the meadowsweet tea. Beneath his feet, he feels the radiating warmth of the hearthstones, a gentle, tingly heat that has been waiting for him all evening. Elend joins him, her presence a familiar, grounding heat beside him. They settle into the furs, the sheepskins compressing with a long, sighing sound that seems to echo the peace of the frontier. The world has been reduced to this small, warm space, a pocket of humanity carved out of the ice and the mud. The silence is now absolute. Even the occasional crack of the timber has ceased as the house has fully settled into the cold. Marcus finds himself focusing on the rhythm of his own breathing, a slow, deep, and steady inhale, pause, exhale. He listens to the answering rhythm from Elend, the two breaths becoming a single, hypnotic pulse. The mind begins to drift, caught in the slow-motion current of the evening, moving away from the tasks of the day and toward the deep, dreamless sea of winter sleep. In this state of near slumber, the frontier no longer feels like a place of hardship. It is a place of profound simplicity, where the value of a fire, A wool blanket and a shared meal is absolute. The marriage, born in the mud and the frost, is a testament to the endurance of warmth. As the last of the tea warmth fades and the hearthstones continue their slow, rhythmic cooling, Marcus feels a sense of total and utter security. The stone walls are thick, the thatch is heavy, and the love is as steady and monotonous as the turning of the earth. The darkness is a friend, a velvet curtain that shuts out the world and leaves only the stillness. The frontier is silent, the snow is still, and the heart of the home is safe. One by one, the thoughts of the day, the grain, the leather, the ice, flicker and go out like dying embers, leaving only the profound, peaceful blankness of the night.